I always thought the biggest threat to my family was a loud neighbor or a stray dog. I never imagined it would be a woman named Linda, the president of our homeowners association. And I definitely never thought her shoving my wife over a flower pot would lead to the U.S. Army rolling into our quiet suburban street. What happened next wasn't just about a broken rule. It was about a secret our town had been hiding for 40 years. A secret that had just been exposed by a pushy woman named Karen. Mark and Sarah had moved to the quiet, idyllic neighborhood of Rosewood Hills 6 months ago. It was the epitome of the American dream. Perfectly manicured lawns, pristine white picket fences, and a silent, almost unsettling sense of order. Mark, a man whose past was as guarded as a high-security vault, had chosen the place for its peaceful anonymity. Sarah, a talented artist, was captivated by the natural light and the sprawling backyard where she could finally build the garden she had always dreamed of. Life was perfect, a bubble of domestic bliss. That bubble, however, had a gatekeeper. Linda, the head of the HOA. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a severe blonde bob, a face that looked permanently displeased, and a clipboard that was her scepter of authority. Her rules were absolute, her word was law, and her inspections were more feared than tax audits. The conflict began with a single blue ceramic flower pot. Sarah had placed it on the edge of their front lawn, a vibrant splash of color to hold her prize-winning petunias. It was a simple, innocent act, but to Linda it was an act of rebellion. The pot was a half-inch over the designated landscaping line, and its color, a vibrant, artistic blue, clashed with the HOA's approved palette of earth tones and neutrals. Linda arrived at their doorstep on a crisp Tuesday afternoon, her face a mask of cold displeasure. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson," she began, her voice a clipped monotone, "I am here regarding an unauthorized landscaping fixture." Mark, who was inside on a conference call, could hear the confrontation from the kitchen. Sarah, confused but calm, tried to explain. "It's just a flower pot, Linda. It brings some joy to the yard." Linda's eyes narrowed. Joy is not an approved landscaping element. The pot violates Bylaw 3B, Section 4, Exterior Decor and Ornaments. It must be moved. Sarah's patience began to wear thin. "Linda, it's harmless. Look, I'll move it a few inches back. How about that?" Linda's clipboard slammed against her thigh. The sound was sharp, final. "The rules are not a suggestion, Mrs. Peterson. They are a covenant. You signed them. You live by them. Now, you will remove this abomination from my view, or I will have it removed for you and bill you for the service." The word "my" hung in the air, a possessive venom. That's when Mark stepped out, his phone still in his hand, the call now silent. His presence was not intimidating in a physical sense. He was an ordinary man, but there was a quiet, deep-seated authority in his stillness, a stillness that made Linda's bluster seem weak. "Linda," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "I think you've made your point. We'll take care of it." Sarah reached for the pot to end the argument, but Linda, fueled by a rage born from Mark's quiet defiance, acted. She saw Sarah's hand on the pot as a final insult. With a sudden swift motion, she pushed Sarah's arm. Sarah stumbled back, her foot catching on a sprinkler head, and she fell hard, the blue ceramic pot flying from her grasp. It hit the pavement with a loud, sickening crack, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah lay on the ground, a pained gasp escaping her lips. Linda, for a brief second, looked shocked at her own action. Mark didn't shout. He didn't rush to Sarah. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on Linda. The calm in his gaze was not comforting. It was terrifying, a cold fire that promised an inferno. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. Linda's triumphant smirk dissolved into fear. Mark slowly, deliberately put his phone to his ear again. His thumb tapped a single button. "Hello?" Linda stammered. I didn't mean to." Mark held up a hand to silence her. "It's not about the pot anymore, Linda," he said, his voice a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. Then his voice became an unrecognizable tone, clear and precise, as if he were giving an order to an army. "Alpha 2 request activation. We have a breach at grid 7 Echo 9. Priority 1. Linda's eyes went wide with pure terror as she heard the chilling words, her perfect, controlled world already beginning to unravel around her feet. The words still hung in the air, cold and precise, a stark contrast to the shattered ceramic pot. Linda stood frozen in Mark's driveway, her face pale as a sheet. She had just heard him, a mild-mannered man who had never raised his voice, utter a phrase that sounded like it belonged in a movie, a code that shattered the illusion of their quiet suburban street. She wanted to laugh it off, to tell him he was being absurd, but the chilling calm in his eyes made the words stick in her throat. Mark finally broke the silence, his voice now back to its normal, kind tone. "The pot is a shame, Linda. I'm sure we can find a replacement." The casualness of the statement was more terrifying than any threat. He helped Sarah to her feet, his touch gentle and reassuring, and led her back into the house. Linda was left standing alone, a solitary figure on the immaculate pavement, surrounded by the ceramic shards that were all that remained of her authority. The next morning, the strangeness began. It was subtle at first. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows was parked 3 houses down, a vehicle so out of place it looked like a spaceship. Later that day, a resident reported seeing a small drone, no bigger than a bird, hovering silently above the neighborhood. Linda, desperate to regain control, grabbed her clipboard and strode towards the black SUV, ready to issue a parking violation. She knocked on the window, but the glass was opaque and no one responded. She rattled the handle, then pounded her fist against it. But the car remained a silent, unyielding fortress. Her authority was a brittle shield, useless against an unseen enemy. As the sun began to set, a man walked up to Mark's house. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in a sharp, expensive suit, a stark contrast to the neighborhood's polo shirts and khaki shorts. He had a look of calm urgency, a man who dealt with high stakes on a daily basis. He knocked on the door and was greeted by Mark. "Mark," the man said, his voice low and professional. "It's Cole. I got your signal." Mark nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. He invited Cole inside, and for the next 30 minutes they spoke in hushed, technical tones. Linda, watching from her window, could only catch fragments of their conversation. She saw them gesturing towards a small, seemingly insignificant patch of land at the end of their cul-de-sac. She heard words like breach, perimeter compromised, and asset protection protocol. The words were meaningless to her, but their gravity was undeniable. She called the police to report suspicious activity, but the dispatcher calmly informed her that they had already been briefed, and that it was a matter of federal jurisdiction. Her power had not just been ignored, it had been made obsolete. The tension in the neighborhood became a palpable thing, a thick, suffocating blanket of unease. Unmarked vehicles began to park on every street. Men in plain clothes and tactical gear were seen moving discreetly through the trees and backyards, their movements silent and purposeful. The once familiar hum of lawnmowers and children's laughter was replaced by a tense silence, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of a radio. Linda's panic was no longer an overreaction. It was a cold, bitter reality. She stood in her front yard as the evening descended, her clipboard held like a useless shield. She looked down the street, and in the distance she saw a low, wavering light. A low rumble began to vibrate through the ground, a sound that grew steadily louder, a deep, mechanical roar that wasn't from any truck or bus she had ever heard. The light grew brighter, and then, from around the bend, the first vehicle appeared. It was a massive, dark green Humvee, its shape unmistakable. Behind it came another, and then a line of them, their tires churning the asphalt. The vehicles were not unmarked this time. They were emblazoned with official U.S. Army symbols. The convoy turned onto her street, its headlights blinding, its engines deafening. The noise swallowed the once quiet neighborhood whole. Linda's face, a second ago filled with a fleeting hope for an explanation, went completely slack. This wasn't a petty threat from a mild-mannered neighbor. This was a force of pure, overwhelming power, and it had arrived because of a flowerpot. The convoy's engines roared, a deafening sound that swallowed the once peaceful street. The first Humvee stopped in front of Mark's house, its wheels crushing the remnants of Sarah's flowerpot. Dozens of soldiers, their faces grim and focused, spilled from the vehicles, moving with a practiced urgency that left no room for doubt or questioning. They set up a perimeter, their rifles held at the ready, turning the quaint suburban street into a fortified zone. An officer, a woman with the stars of a brigadier general on her uniform, stepped from a command vehicle and walked directly to Mark's front door. Her presence was cold, efficient, and left Linda, who stood bewildered in her yard, completely ignored. Mark opened the door, and the general's gaze met his. "Mark," she said, her voice a low command. "I'm General Evans. We need to secure the area and assess the integrity of the asset immediately. The vibration from the breach is escalating." She pointed her gloved hand towards the small, unassuming patch of land at the end of the cul-de-sac. Linda, her mind reeling, finally found her voice. "What is going on?" "This is a violation of city code and my HOA authority." General Evans didn't even turn to look at her, speaking only to Mark. "The city code, ma'am, is no longer applicable. This entire area, including your cul-de-sac, was built in the early 1980s as a strategic cover for Project Nightfall. It was a high-level Cold War research and development facility for experimental non-lethal sonic weaponry." The words hit Linda like a physical blow. The quiet perfection she had so fiercely guarded was a lie. Her power, her rules, her very world was built on top of a military secret. General Evans continued, her words painting a terrifying picture. The asset, an unstable sonic prototype, was left behind when the project was decommissioned. Its failsafe was tied to a unique vibrational frequency, a pattern so specific it was considered impossible to trigger accidentally. It seems your little dispute, the physical force used to push Mrs. Peterson, and the subsequent shattering of that ceramic pot on this specific ground, was the 1 in a billion chance that created that exact frequency. You didn't just push a woman, Linda. You initiated a security breach. The truth was a physical weight, crushing Linda's ego into dust. Her petty tyranny was the catalyst for a potential disaster. The army was not there because of her, but to contain the threat she had unwittingly unleashed. The look on Linda's face was a mixture of utter disbelief and dawning, suffocating horror. Mark's calm demeanor now made terrible sense. He wasn't a civilian caught in a neighborhood spat. He was a man who understood the true scale of the danger. As they spoke, a soldier ran up to General Evans, his face pale with alarm. He spoke in a panicked whisper, but Linda heard every word. "General, the prototype's power levels are spiking. It's not a failsafe anymore. It's an activation. We're losing containment." The general's eyes widened. She turned towards a megaphone and grabbed it with a swift motion. "Attention, all residents of Rosewood Hills." Her voice boomed, cutting through the tense silence. "This is an urgent military evacuation order. You have 10 minutes to gather essential belongings and proceed to the designated safety zone. I repeat, this is not a drill. You must evacuate immediately." The words were a stark, terrifying contrast to Linda's usual measured complaints, and for the first time her rigid world was not just breaking, it was collapsing entirely. The evacuation order tore through the peaceful evening air, a siren call of chaos that shattered the last remnants of suburban normalcy. The scene immediately erupted in a panicked ballet of fear. Residents stumbled from their homes, some in pajamas, others clutching pets and hastily packed bags. The orderly lines and designated zones that General Evans had announced were forgotten. People screamed, children cried, and the low, guttural roar of the military vehicles was now just part of the terrifying symphony. Linda, standing frozen in her front yard, was completely lost. She raised her clipboard, her mouth forming a protest, but no one paid her any mind. A soldier, his face impassive, pushed past her without a word. Her neighbors, people she had lorded over for years, rushed by, their faces a mix of terror and disbelief, giving her nothing more than a passing glance. Her power, her rigid control, was now utterly meaningless. She was just another civilian, a single voice in a sea of noise. Mark found her standing by the curb, clutching the clipboard to her chest like a shield. She looked disheveled, her perfect bob now askew, a tear streak cutting through the dust on her cheek. Mark's voice was calm and steady, a beacon of terrifying rationality in the madness. "They told you to evacuate, Linda. You should go." Linda turned to him, her eyes wide. But what about the regulations? Who is going to ensure order? My perennials?" Her voice trailed off, a pathetic whimper in the face of the true chaos around them. "There are no regulations anymore," Mark said, his voice flat. He looked at the clipboard in her hand. "That's not a weapon, Linda. It's just a piece of plastic. And your rules? They're nothing. They were never about order. They were about control. You wanted so badly to control every blade of grass, every color, every detail, and in your arrogance you triggered something you couldn't even begin to understand. You were so busy obsessing over a half-inch of lawn that you stumbled upon a secret that should have stayed buried." His words were not angry. They were a cold, hard truth, and they landed with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't gloating. He was simply stating a fact, and that was worse than any shouted insult. You didn't get what you wanted, Linda. You got what you deserved. Your need to be right, to have power over others, is the reason this whole neighborhood is now a scene of a classified government operation. You endangered everyone, not with a crime, but with your simple, petty self-importance. Linda's shoulders slumped. She looked around at the chaos, at the soldiers, at the fear on her neighbors' faces, and then back at the man who had just dismantled her entire reality with a few simple words. She had pushed his wife, a small, selfish act that had unleashed a torrent of consequences she could not comprehend. As a final, surreal moment, a Black Hawk military helicopter descended from the sky, its powerful rotors creating a whirlwind that tore through the trees and scattered debris across the street. It landed in the very center of the cul-de-sac, its engines thrumming with silent power. A soldier, his face completely expressionless, stepped out and walked directly toward Linda. He didn't speak. He simply held out a single sealed manila envelope. Linda's breath caught in her throat. Her hands were shaking as she reached out and took the envelope. She clutched it, the crisp paper feeling heavy and final. The soldier gave a final nod, an acknowledgement of a completed transaction, then returned to the helicopter. Mark watched from a distance as Linda stood alone in the swirling dust. The clipboard, now discarded on the ground, a useless relic of a forgotten time, her eyes fixed on the sealed envelope in her hand, filled with a dread that was far colder and deeper than any fear she had ever known. The helicopter's roar faded into a distant thrum, leaving behind a chilling, profound silence. The military convoy, its mission complete, began to pull away, leaving the street an empty, scarred battlefield of trampled lawns and tire tracks. Linda stood alone in the center of her lawn, the sealed manila envelope clutched in her hands. Her heart pounded in her ears, a drum of pure dread. She tore it open, her fingers shaking, and pulled out a single stark document. It wasn't a fine. It wasn't a court summons. It was an official letter, bearing the seal of a high-level government agency, and it was a masterpiece of cold, bureaucratic cruelty. The document invoked a little-known clause from the National Security Real Estate Forfeiture Act and declared her property, at the center of the grid breach, to be an immediate and permanent asset of the United States government. The forfeiture was non-negotiable. Her house, her lawn, her garden, the very source of her power and identity, was now state property. She was given 48 hours to vacate. It wasn't about punishment. It was about procedure. Her home had become a monument to her folly, a symbol of what happens when petty power clashes with forces far beyond one's comprehension. She didn't scream or rage. There was a single, silent tear that traced a line down her cheek as the paper slipped from her numb fingers and fluttered to the ground. The next day, the military operation was officially declared over. The soldiers were gone, the perimeter was down, and the neighborhood was left to pick up the pieces of its shattered reality. The pristine facade of Rosewood Hills was gone forever, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. Linda's story became a whisper, a local legend. The HOA Queen had been stripped of everything, her carefully constructed world collapsing with the silent efficiency of a demolition crew. There was no victory for Mark or Sarah in her downfall. Her fate felt less like a triumph and more like a warning. They looked at their own home and saw it for what it was, a house on top of a lie. The perfect, curated life they thought they had was an illusion, one that had been irrevocably shattered. The safety was gone. replaced by the chilling knowledge that beneath the surface of their quiet community lay a secret powerful enough to bring in an army. They quietly put the house up for sale. 6 months later, they found their new home. It was a small farmhouse on 5 acres, far from any neighbors, any rule makers, or any secrets. The silence here was real, not manicured. On a quiet afternoon, Mark and Sarah were sitting on their porch, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The radio was on, playing a soft country song, but a news report broke through for a moment. The reporter mentioned an obscure government story, a seemingly harmless audit of a Cold War project that had resulted in the controversial acquisition of private property for national security purposes. The news anchor dismissed it as a minor legal formality. Mark and Sarah exchanged a look. It wasn't a look of victory or triumph, but one of quiet, shared knowledge. Their peace was hard-won, a peace that came from knowing the real world was far bigger and more dangerous than any HOA meeting. Sarah walked to the porch railing and gently placed a single, vibrant, blue ceramic flower pot on the edge. This time, it was not a defiance of a rule. It was a quiet reminder that sometimes the most profound victories are the ones that no one else can see.